"Get in the truck," he said, "now, before they come back." She looked at him, this kid, this nobody from nowhere, and said, "You don't know what you just walked into." He didn't, but he'd already thrown the first punch. And out here on 40 acres of corn and silence, there was no walking anything back. If this story hits you the way it hit me, subscribe to the channel and follow along all the way to the end. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. The morning Ethan Ward's life changed forever started the same way every morning. Started with the smell of diesel and the sound of his father coughing through the kitchen wall. He was 23 years old and he had never in his life slept past 5:30. That wasn't discipline, that was survival. The Ward farm didn't care about your rest schedule. The combine had been throwing a code since Tuesday. The north irrigation line had developed a slow leak. Nobody could pin down, and the bank, always the bank, had sent another letter that his mother had quietly slid under a stack of seed catalogs. Like hiding it would change what was inside. Ethan had seen her do it. He hadn't said anything. There was nothing to say. He pulled on his work boots on the porch step, the laces fraying at the tips, the way they'd been fraying for 6 months, and he stood up and looked out at the corn. 40 acres. His grandfather had farmed a yachty. His father had been forced to sell the South half 12 years ago when the drought took 3 harvests in a row. Now they worked what was left like they could make it feel like it used to be, and some mornings in the gray gold light before the sun fully cleared the tree line, Ethan could almost believe it. Almost. He grabbed the fence post tool off the porch rail and headed for the east edge of the property where 2 posts had heaved out of the ground during the last hard frost. He walked the path he'd walked 1,000 times between rows that hadn't been planted yet, the soil still cold and dark from overnight. His boots left clean prints in it. The air smelled like iron and turned earth and the faint sweetness of something green trying to come up through the cold. He was 30 yards from the fence line when he heard the crash. Not a boom, not an explosion. A crash, the specific ugly sound of metal folding against something that doesn't move, followed by the groan of a vehicle rocking on its frame, and then silence. The kind of silence that comes after something violent when the world hasn't decided yet whether to stay quiet or break open. Ethan stopped walking. The sound had come from the county road. The road ran along the eastern edge of the property, separated from the field by a shallow ditch and a line of scrub trees that had never been cleared because his grandfather had thought they broke the wind. You couldn't see the road from where Ethan stood. You could hear it. He waited. Listened. Nothing. No horn. No second impact. No engine revving back to life. He stood there for another 3 seconds, and then he moved toward the tree line. He told himself later that he didn't know why, that it was just instinct or reflex or the simple human impulse to go toward a sound that meant something had gone wrong. But the truth was more specific than that. The truth was that he'd grown up on that road. He knew every vehicle that used it regularly, the Henderson's old Silverado, the grain truck that ran on Tuesdays, the school bus route that stopped half a mile north. At 5:47 in the morning in early April on a county road that saw maybe 12 cars a day, a crash wasn't an accident waiting to be explained. It was a question. He pushed through the scrub trees and stopped at the ditch edge. The car had gone off the road at an angle, the front right quarter panel buried in the soft shoulder. The hood crumpled against the wooden fence post it had struck. It wasn't moving. The engine had quit. One headlight was still burning, pointed sideways at the ditch, throwing a cold cone of light at nothing. Ethan's first thought was medical. Concussion. Airbag deployment. He was already thinking about whether his phone would have signal as he started down the ditch bank. His second thought came when he saw the second vehicle. It was parked 20 yards up the road, facing the wrong direction, facing back toward town, which meant it had been coming from the other way, had turned around and pulled up behind the crash. A dark SUV, no plates visible from where he stood. Engine running. He could see the exhaust in the cold air. He stopped at the bottom of the ditch. 3 men got out of the SUV. They moved with purpose, not the frantic scrambling of people who'd witnessed an accident and were rushing to help. Purposeful, coordinated. One went to the driver's side of the crashed car. One went to the passenger side. The third stood at the rear, and as Ethan watched, he opened the trunk. Ethan didn't move. The man at the driver's side said something. Ethan couldn't hear the words, only the tone low, commanding the cadence of someone giving an order, not offering help. Then he reached in through the window. From the trunk of the crashed car, the third man pulled out a woman. She fought. That was the first thing Ethan registered before he registered anything else. She fought hard. She was older, small, and she fought with her elbows and her heels in the back of her skull, and the man holding her had to use both arms to keep her off the ground. She said something Ethan couldn't make out, and the man said something back, and then the one at the driver's door said something sharp to both of them, and they all went quiet. Ethan stood in the ditch with his fence post tool in his right hand, and he thought with a clarity that surprised him given that his heart was hammering and his palms had gone cold. He thought she was in the trunk. Not the crash, not an accident. The car had been forced off the road or had driven off trying to escape, and there had been a woman locked in the trunk, and these three men with no license plates had pulled up behind it at 5:47 in the morning on a road where nobody would see them. His phone was in his back pocket. He already knew the answer, but he pulled it out anyway and looked at the screen. No signal. There was never signal this far east on the property. The ridge killed it. He'd complained about it to his father 100 times. He put the phone back. The woman was still fighting. The man holding her had shifted his grip, one arm locked around her throat, not tight enough to choke, but tight enough to control. She had both hands on his forearm, fingers digging in. Her feet kept finding the ground and pushing and losing it again. The man at the driver's door had finished whatever he was doing inside the car. He straightened up and turned toward the trunk man and the woman and said something in a low voice that carried a finality to it, the sound of a decision being made, and Ethan saw the third man, the one who'd been at the passenger side, reach behind his back. Ethan moved. He didn't think about it the way people describe thinking about things. There was no internal monologue, no pros and cons, no moment of steeling himself. One part of his brain registered the gun, and another part registered the woman, and the gap between those two data points closed in about a quarter of a second, and then he was moving up the ditch bank at a low angle, staying below the sight line of the scrub trees using the wrecked car's cover. He had 40 yards, and the darkness and the fact that they weren't looking at the ditch. He had a fence post tool, a long steel bar with a blunt tip used for driving posts into clay soil. He had 3 years of loading hay bales from the time he was 16 and could throw a 60-pound bale overhead without losing his footing. He had 23 years of knowing exactly what the ground felt like under his boots in the dark. He had nothing else. The man with the gun had it out now, but pointed at the ground casual like it was a formality. The woman had gone still, which told Ethan she was smart. She'd spotted the weapon, and she was choosing her moment, not wasting her energy. The man with his arm around her throat said something. The one who'd been at the driver's side laughed, short, dismissive, the sound of men who believed nobody was watching. Ethan came around the rear of the crashed car at a dead run. He had one priority, and it was the man with the gun, because the man with the gun was the variable that turned everything else into a problem without a solution. He covered the last 10 feet in 2 strides and swung the post tool in a flat arc at the man's right arm, the arm holding the weapon, and he hit it. He hit it hard. He felt the impact all the way up into his shoulder, and the gun went down into the gravel. And the man made a sound that was more shock than pain and went down with it, grabbing his arm. Then everything happened at once. The woman drove her elbow back into the throat of the man holding her. She'd been waiting for exactly this. Ethan understood later she'd been waiting for the distraction, and the man choked and his grip broke, and she twisted free. The third man, the one from the driver's door, came around the hood of the crashed car, moving fast, and he was bigger than Ethan had clocked from the ditch, bigger and broader, and he didn't hesitate. He came straight at Ethan with both hands reaching. Ethan ducked under his reach. The man's hands closed on air. Ethan drove his shoulder into the man's midsection, not a tackle, not elegant, just mass moving against mass. And they hit the hood of the crashed car together, and Ethan bounced off, and the man bounced off. And for a second, they were both just trying to stay upright. The man with the hurt arm was on the ground, still down, still cursing, one hand pressing the gravel. The woman said sharply from somewhere to Ethan's left, "The road." Ethan didn't understand at first. Then he did. She wasn't pointing at an escape. She was warning him. A vehicle far off, but coming, headlights sweeping the curve a quarter-mile north. The big man had found his footing. He looked at Ethan, looked at the oncoming lights, looked at the man on the ground, and made a calculation. He grabbed the man with the hurt arm by the collar and hauled him toward the SUV. He said something to the third man, and the third man followed, already moving. The gun was still in the gravel. The SUV doors slammed. The vehicle didn't burn out, it pulled away controlled, deliberate, no squealing tires, because squealing tires are how you get remembered. In 6 seconds, it was up the road and past the curve and gone. Ethan stood in the gravel next to the wrecked car and breathed. The approaching vehicle slowed, seemed to hesitate, then continued north without stopping. Probably saw the crash, probably decided it was already handled, probably told themselves they'd call it in from the next town. People made choices like that all the time. He understood it, and he didn't blame them, and he filed it away for later. He looked at the woman. She was standing 6 feet away, both hands at her sides, watching him with an expression that he couldn't fully read in the half-dark. She was older, he'd had the impression of gray hair, and he was right, silver gray, cut short and practical. She was wearing a dark jacket, practical clothes, no jewelry, except a ring on her right hand that caught the remaining headlight. She was breathing hard, but controlled the breath of someone who'd trained herself not to show fear even when she felt it. She looked at him the way you'd look at something unexpected, that you hadn't decided yet was good or bad. He looked at her. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No." She glanced at the gun in the gravel. "Pick that up." He did. He didn't know much about guns. His father kept a shotgun for coyotes, and that was the extent of the Ward family's firearms education. But he knew not to leave it lying in the road, and he knew not to point it at anyone, and those two things seemed like the minimum required competence for the moment. He put it in his jacket pocket. "They'll be back," she said. It wasn't a question. "How many more of them are there?" "More than 3. He thought about the farm, the house, his parents still asleep inside. He thought about the 40 acres of corn rows between the road and the house, dark, dense, disorienting if you didn't know them. "Can you walk?" "Yes." "We need to move. Now." She didn't argue. He didn't know yet that she almost never argued, that she was a woman who moved through the world by reading situations and making decisions, and that the decision she'd made about him in the last 45 seconds was the kind of assessment that usually took people considerably longer. She just moved. She fell in beside him, matching his pace, and he led her back through the scrub trees and down into the ditch and up the other side into his field. The corn rows closed around them. It was dark enough that you had to know which way you were going or you'd circle. Ethan knew. They walked fast, not running. Running made noise, and noise was information. And for the first 2 minutes, neither of them spoke. He was listening to the road behind them, and she was listening to the road behind them, and neither of them heard anything except their own footsteps in the soft soil and the wind through the stalks. Then she said quietly, "What's your name?" "Ethan. Ethan Ward." "How old are you, Ethan?" 23. A pause, then, "You came at them from the ditch." "Yes." "You saw the gun." "Yes." "And you still came." He didn't have a good answer for that, so he didn't give one. He just said, "You were in the trunk." "Yes," she said. "I was." Another pause. Longer this time. They were halfway across the field now, the house lights visible through the last rows. "You should know," she said, "what you walked into tonight. You should know what it is." "Tell me." She told him her name. Rosa Mendoza. The name meant nothing to him. He was 23 years old and had spent his entire life on 40 acres in Iowa, and the name Rosa Mendoza was not a name that had ever come up in his world. He said, "Okay," the way you say okay when you're giving someone room to say more. She said, "My son is going to want to meet you." He held back the last row of corn stalks for her, and they stepped out into the yard behind the barn. He could see his house 60 yards off. The kitchen light was on. Now his mother was up, starting coffee, the exact same routine she'd followed since before he was born. "Who's your son?" he said. She looked at him with that same weighing expression, and for the first time something shifted in it. Not warmth, exactly, but the edge of it, the consideration of warmth. "His name is Marco," she said. "He runs the Iowa chapter of the Hells Angels." Ethan stood in his own yard in the dark, holding a handgun he didn't know how to use, and the world he'd woken up inside that morning was already a completely different world than the one he stood in now. He said, "We need to go inside." "Taha." She said, "Agreed." They went inside. His mother, Patricia Ward, was 58 years old, had grown up on a farm 40 miles away, and had married a farmer and worked herself into the shape of a woman who treated every unexpected thing with the same measured response she'd applied to an irrigation failure or a late frost. Not calm, exactly, but competency, performing calm. She turned from the coffee maker when they came through the back door and looked at her son and the woman beside him, and she didn't say anything for a moment, just took in what she was seeing. Ethan said, "Mom, we have a situation." Patricia Ward set down her coffee mug, looked at the dirt on Ethan's boots and the state of Rosa's jacket, and the particular expression on her son's face that she recognized from when he was 12 and had gotten into something he hadn't anticipated and didn't know how to explain. And she said, "I'll get your father." "Let him sleep," Ethan said. "Your father," Patricia said, with a finality that was not negotiable, "will want to be awake for this." She went down the hall. Ethan and Rosa sat at the kitchen table. Rosa looked at the room with the same careful attention she'd given everything else, cataloging it without commenting. The table was old pine scarred from 20 years of use. There was a salt shaker shaped like a rooster. There was a stack of bills at the corner that hadn't been hidden fast enough. Rosa looked at the bills and then looked at the window at the dark outside. "They'll check the road within an hour," she said. "When they don't find me, they'll expand the search. Anyone who lives near the crash site is a variable they'll want to eliminate." "Eliminate," Ethan repeated. "Yes." He put the gun on the table between them. She looked at it. "You should keep that." "I don't know how to use it." "It's a Glock 19, she said. "Safety's built into the trigger. Point it at what you want to stop and pull. That's all you need to know right now." He looked at her. "You've used guns." "I've been around guns my entire adult life." She paused. "I don't apologize for that." "I didn't ask you to." Something in the air between them shifted some minor alignment. His father came into the kitchen. Gerald Ward was 59, thin in the way that hard outdoor work makes men thin, lean, not frail, with hands that look at carved rather than grown, and a face that had spent decades in weather. He looked at Rosa and at the gun on the table and at his son, and his expression moved through several things quickly and arrived at something workable. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from Rosa. "Tell me," he said. So she told them. Not everything Ethan understood later, that she gave them what they needed and held back what they didn't, which was its own kind of skill. She told them that she'd been traveling, that she'd been taken off the road before she could reach her destination, that the men who took her were connected to people who had money and power in this county and had used both badly. That she'd gotten free, she glanced at Ethan when she said this, and that she needed to make one phone call, and that after the phone call was made, she needed to ask something of this family. Gerald said, "Ask." "I need to stay here until morning," she said. "Maybe until just before dawn. And I need you to understand that by saying yes, you're making a choice that has consequences." "What kind of consequences?" "The people who took me will look for me. They might look here." Gerald's jaw tightened. He looked at Ethan. Ethan gave a small nod, confirming not deciding. Gerald said, "What happened to the men who took you?" Rosa said, "Two of them left. One of them is still on the road." Gerald looked at Ethan again. Ethan said, "He's not dead. I hit his arm with a post driver. He went down and they took him when they left." Gerald sat with this for a moment. Then he said, "Make your phone call." Rosa Mendoza took a phone from the inside pocket of her jacket, an older model, the kind people carried when they wanted something durable over something smart, and she found a number from memory without looking at the contacts. She held the phone to her ear. It rang twice. The voice that answered was male young and went from asleep to awake in the space of a single second, the way soldiers learn to do. Rosa said, "It's me. I'm safe. I need a location call." A pause. The voice said, "Where are you?" Rosa looked at Gerald Ward. Gerald gave her the county road number and the nearest cross street. She repeated it into the phone. The voice on the other end said, "Stay there." And then, with a weight to it that Ethan didn't understand yet, "Is anyone with you who helped?" Rosa looked at Ethan across the kitchen table. The bill stack was still in the corner. The rooster salt shaker was still there. The coffee maker was still dripping. She said yes, a young man named Ethan Ward. The voice on the other end said, "Tell him he did right." She ended the call. Patricia Ward set a cup of coffee in front of Rosa. She set one in front of her son. She put her hand on Ethan's shoulder briefly, just 1 second, and then she went to stand at the counter. Outside, the sky was beginning to differentiate from the land. The blackness was going gray at the edges, the kind of gray that precedes light without yet being it. Rosa wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, she looked at Ethan. "The man who answered," she said, "his name is Marco, my son. Ethan nodded. He's going to come, she said. He and his chapter, and some others. How many others? She held his gaze steadily. Quite a few. Gerald said, what are we dealing with exactly? These people who took you. What is this? Rosa set down the coffee. She was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone uncertain, but the quiet of someone choosing precision. There's a man named Decker, she said. He runs a cartel operation through this county. Not drugs primarily, though. There's that, too. Land. He's been buying land, pressuring owners who don't want to sell using a local official to make the pressure legal. When that doesn't work, he uses other methods. Gerald's expression had gone very still. Rosa continued, the local official is your county sheriff. His name is Carl Briggs. Patricia made a sound at the counter. Not loud, just a sound. Gerald said, Briggs. Rosa said, you know him. He's the one who pushed the assessment on our north acreage, Gerald said slowly. 2 years ago, bumped our tax burden by 30% on land that hadn't changed. We thought it was a mistake. We fought it and lost. Rosa looked at him for a long moment. It wasn't a mistake. The kitchen was very quiet. Ethan thought about the letter under the seed catalogs. He thought about his father's hands at the dinner table, the specific stillness of a man who'd run out of options and hadn't said so yet. He thought about 40 acres being 40 acres instead of 80 because of a drought 12 years ago. And he thought about what Rosa had just told them, and he thought about how the world arranges itself in ways you can't see until someone takes you to the right angle. He said, what was in the car, the one that crashed? Was that your car? Rosa said. No, I was taken from a rest stop. My car is still there. They were moving me in the trunk of their vehicle when the driver lost control. He was on the phone driving too fast and he went off the shoulder. Lucky, Ethan said. It wasn't entirely luck, she said. I kicked the seat panel from inside, hard enough to affect the driver's focus. Patricia Ward from the counter said, good for you. Rosa looked at her. Something passed between the two women, something quick and unspoken and mutual. The man on the phone, Ethan said. Marco, when you told him where you were, he said he'd come. Yes. It's an hour before dawn. Yes. And he said he'd come. Rosa met his eyes. He'll come, she said, and he won't come alone. I want you to be prepared for that, Ethan. When the sun comes up, your farm is going to look very different than it does right now. He didn't fully understand that yet. He was 23 and he'd grown up on 40 acres and he had some idea of what an outlaw motorcycle club was in the abstract, the way everyone did from news coverage and movies, in the ambient cultural noise of a country that had a complicated relationship with men who moved outside its rules. What he didn't have was a picture of what 2,000 men arriving at dawn looked like. That picture was coming. But first, there was the matter of the hour before dawn, and the men who were already looking, and the county sheriff whose name had just landed in Ethan Ward's kitchen like a stone into still water, and the ripples from that stone were already moving outward in every direction, touching things he couldn't yet see. Rosa set down her coffee cup. She looked at the window. She looked at Ethan. They'll be at the road in 40 minutes, she said, checking the crash site. When they don't find me, they'll expand. Ethan said, then we need to be ready. Gerald Ward pushed back his chair. He stood up, lean, weather-carved 6 feet of him, and he looked at his son, and for 1 second, something moved across his face, something between fear and a thing that was on the other side of fear, older than it, steadier. He said, son, what do you need? Ethan Ward looked at his father across the scarred pine table and he said, every light in this house off, and the truck pulled into the barn. Gerald nodded. He went. Patricia started shutting off lights. Rosa Mendoza sat at the kitchen table in the growing dark, and she watched this family move, and her expression did something it hadn't done since they'd come through the door. It softened. Not much, just enough. Outside on 40 acres of Iowa corn, the last of the night was holding. But not for long. Gerald killed the last light at 4:52 in the morning. The house went dark room by room. The kitchen, the hallway, the living room with its single lamp that had been burning since Patricia got up, and when the final switch was thrown, the farmhouse became just another shape against the field, indistinguishable from the barn, from the grain shed, from the dark geometry of a working farm that had been sleeping. Except nobody inside it was sleeping. Ethan stood at the kitchen window with the curtain pulled back an inch and watched the road. Rosa sat at the table behind him. She hadn't moved in 10 minutes, which was his own kind of discipline. The ability to go still when going still was what the situation required. Patricia was in the hallway with her back to the wall, close enough to hear everything said in the kitchen, far enough to be away from the windows. Gerald was in the barn pulling the truck in the way Ethan had asked, quiet and methodical, the way he did everything. "How many vehicles did you see them using?" Ethan asked. "The SUV," Rosa said, "and at least one more. I heard 2 engines at the rest stop." "So minimum 2 teams." "Minimum." He let the curtain fall back. "When they find the crash site empty, they'll go systematic. Houses within a half-mile of the road." "Yes." "That's us." "Yes." He turned from the window. "How long do we have before Marco gets here?" Rosa was quiet for a moment. "He was in Des Moines. He'll move fast." "That's an hour and 40 minutes. He'll move faster than that." Ethan thought about that. He thought about what moving faster than that looked like when the person doing the moving was who Marco Mendoza apparently was. Gerald came back through the door and said, "Truck's in," closed it up. He looked at Ethan. "You want to tell me what the plan is for if they come to the door before your friend's son gets here?" "They won't come to the door," Ethan said. Gerald waited. "A door means witnesses," Ethan said. "They're not going to knock on a farmhouse door at 5 in the morning. If they come here, they'll come to the barn first, check for the car, see if anyone's been where they shouldn't be. And if they find something," Ethan looked at Rosa. Rosa said, "If they find this house, Ethan, you need to tell your parents to leave. Through the north field. There's a neighbor a mile up." "The Petersons," Patricia said from the hallway. "Go there. Don't call anyone. Don't explain. Just be there." Patricia said, "And you two?" Rosa said, "We'll manage." Patricia came into the kitchen doorway. She looked at Rosa with the kind of directness that women who've run households and farms and raised children for decades develop, not unfriendly, just unadorned. She said, "I'm not leaving my house on account of some men with bad intentions and no license plates." Rosa looked at her. "Mrs. Ward?" "Patricia." "Patricia, these are not small men in a small operation. If they come here and they find you, the conversation will not go the way conversations usually go." Patricia was quiet for 2 seconds. Then she said, "Then they'd better not find us." Gerald made a sound that in another context might have been a laugh. Rosa looked at the two of them, these two people who'd built 40 acres and a kitchen table and a life out of clay soil and hard weather, and she said, "All right." "All right," Patricia agreed. Ethan's phone buzzed on the table. He grabbed it. The screen said no signal, but the buzz had been a notification, something that had come through on the edge of a connection so thin it barely counted. He looked at it. It was a text. Unknown number. It said Field Road East, Gate. 10 minutes. Ethan read it twice, looked at Rosa. She said, "Let me see." He handed her the phone. She read it and something in her face changed, something that was relief arriving in a person who'd trained herself not to show relief openly, so it showed in small ways in the set of her jaw, and the breath she let out through her nose, and the way her eyes went briefly closed. She handed the phone back. "That's Marco," she said. 10 minutes, Ethan said. "Yes." "The Field Road East is locked. We chain it in winter and I haven't pulled the chain yet." Rosa said, "Then you should go pull it." He was already moving. He went out the back door and across the yard with his head down, moving fast using the barn as cover from the roadside. The field road was a rutted 2-track that ran along the fence line from the county road to the back of the property. His grandfather had used it for equipment, and his father had used it less. And for the past 3 years, Ethan had used it mostly to check the fence line after storms. It met the county road 200 yards north of the crash site, 200 yards north of where those men had been an hour ago. He found the chain in the dark by feel the padlock cold and damp in his hand, and he worked the combination by memory. His birthday, because his father had set it when Ethan was 12 and had never changed it, and the lock opened and he pulled the chain free and dropped it beside the post and stood at the edge of the field road and looked north toward the county road. He saw the lights first. Not headlights, these were lower set farther apart, the lights of motorcycles. More than one, more than 10, more than he could count from where he stood. They came in off the county road without slowing. They knew the turn, or someone had told them the turn, and they came through it in formation single file, and the sound of them was something Ethan had never heard before. Not loud, not the television version of motorcycle noise, but deep and multiple. and present like weather that had decided to be mechanical. The first rider came up the field road and stopped 15 feet from Ethan and cut his engine. He was a large man. He was wearing a leather vest over a dark jacket, and even in the low light, Ethan could see the patches. He had his father's face, the same jaw, the same eyes, but 30 years younger and carrying 30 years of different weight. He took off his helmet. He said, "Ethan Ward." It wasn't a question. Ethan said, "Marco." Marco Mendoza looked at him for a long moment. His eyes moved the way people's eyes move when they're running an assessment and they're good at it. He looked at the field road and the barn shape and the dark house and then back at Ethan. He said, "Where is she, kitchen?" Ethan said. "She's fine. She's drinking coffee." Something in Marco's face moved, something big and controlled, like a wave hitting a seawall and dispersing. He breathed out. He said, "Good." Behind him, the bikes had stopped coming. Ethan couldn't count too many, too dark, but he counted what he could see and stopped when the number stopped making sense. Marco swung off the bike. He was tall-built the way men who spend their lives outdoors, and physical build with the specific kind of stillness that comes from confidence rather than restraint. He put his hand out. Ethan shook it. Marco held the grip for a moment longer than a handshake usually lasts. He said, "She told me what you did. I did what made sense. Not to most people it wouldn't." Ethan didn't answer that. Marco said, "Take me to her." They walked to the house. Behind them, Ethan heard the organized quiet of men who didn't need to be told what to do. Positions being taken, a perimeter being established, the specific controlled silence of people who'd done this before. No shouting, no engines, just movement and placement. Gerald met them at the back door. He looked at Marco and put out his hand, and Marco shook it. Gerald said, "Your mother is a remarkable woman." Marco said, "Yes, sir, she is." They went inside. Rosa was standing when they came through the door. She'd stood when she heard them coming. Ethan realized she'd been listening to the bikes approach and had stood up without thinking about it, the body moving before the mind caught up. Marco crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and put both arms around his mother and Rosa Mendoza, who had been locked in a car trunk and had fought 3 armed men and had sat at a stranger's kitchen table for the better part of an hour without showing anything she didn't choose to show, pressed her face into her son's shoulder, and for a few seconds said nothing at all. Patricia Ward turned to face the window. Gerald Ward looked at the ceiling. Ethan looked at the floor. Some moments were private, even in a small kitchen with 4 people in it. Then Rosa stepped back. She put her hands on Marco's face briefly. 1 second, a mother's gesture, a check of him as much as a connection, and then she dropped them and straightened and was back to being Rosa Mendoza, clear-eyed and present. She said, "How many came?" "Enough," Marco said. "Tell me the number." "A lot more than we need," Rosa said. Marco. Marco said, "Word got out, past the chapter, past the region." He paused. "You have a lot of people who want to be here right now." Rosa looked at him steadily. "How many?" He met her eyes. "By sunrise," he said carefully, "somewhere north of 2,000. The kitchen was very quiet. Gerald Ward sat down in his chair. 2,000. Ethan turned the number over. He thought about the field road, the county road, the farm. He thought about 40 acres. He said, "Where are they going to put them all?" Marco looked at him. "We'll manage it. We've done larger." He turned back to Rosa. "The site, we need to talk about Decker." Rosa said, "You know about Decker." "I know the name. We've known the name for a while. We didn't know he had reached this far north." His jaw tightened. "We know more now." "The sheriff," Ethan said. Marco looked at him. "Briggs," Ethan said. "Rosa told us. Briggs has been working with the cartel, using county assessments to squeeze landowners, forcing sales." Marco was watching him with a focused attention. "The assessment they put on our north acreage," Gerald said quietly from his chair. 2 years ago, we lost the appeal." Marco looked from Gerald to Ethan to Rosa and back to Ethan. He said, "How much land have you lost?" Gerald said, "We were at 80. We sold the South 40 under pressure when we couldn't cover the debt load. We didn't know it was manufactured." The word manufactured landed in the room like a stone. Marco said it was manufactured, not a question. His voice had gone flat in a specific way, not loud, not performed, just factual and very cold. Gerald put his hands flat on the table and looked at them. Patricia turned from the window. Her eyes were bright and her voice was steady when she said, "They took our land." Nobody said anything. Then Ethan said, "Where is Decker right now?" Marco looked at him. Rosa said, "We believe he operates out of a property northeast of town. There's an old quarry, Henderson Quarry," Ethan said. Rosa stopped. Ethan said, "It closed down in 2009. The land was sold to an LLC 4 years ago. Nobody local knows who the LLC is, but there's been activity out there. Equipment, people. We assumed it was some kind of redevelopment." Marco said, "It's not redevelopment." "No," Ethan said. "I didn't think so." Marco was looking at him with an expression that was partly assessment and partly something else. He said, "You know how to get there. I've driven past it 100 times. Could you lead us there?" Ethan felt the question land in his chest. He felt the weight of it, not fear exactly, but the recognition of a door opening. One of those doors that once you walk through it, you are categorically somewhere different than you were. He said yes. Rosa said, "Not yet. Not until we know the full situation." She looked at Marco. "What do your people have?" "We have eyes on Briggs's house. He left at 4:20 this morning heading northeast, which confirms the quarry location. We have the rest stop where they took you. We're pulling footage from a gas station camera half a mile away." He paused. "And we have a name, a man named Cruz. He's Decker's point person in this county. Ran the operation on the ground." "The man with the hurt arm," Ethan said. Marco looked at him sharply. "Say that again." "When I came at them at the road, one of them had a gun. I hit his arm with a post driver. He went down and they pulled him when they left." He paused. "His right arm. Bad hit. I felt the impact." Marco took out his phone. He typed something. He said, "What did he look like?" Ethan described him. Average height, stocky, late 40s, dark jacket, short hair. He described the way the man moved when he recovered fast to compensate left-hand dominant in the aftermath. Marco typed. 30 seconds later, his phone buzzed. He looked at the screen and said, "Cruz, that's Cruz." He looked at Ethan. A 23-year-old farm kid put Decker's county coordinator on the ground with a post driver. Ethan said nothing. Gerald Ward looked at his son from across the table, and his expression was something Ethan had never seen on his father's face before. He didn't have a word for it. He filed it away. Marco said, "Cruz is the link. If he's at the quarry, he's our way into the operational structure. If we can put him in front of a federal agent with what we have, the whole county operation comes apart." He paused. "There's an FBI contact who's been working the land acquisition angle for 18 months. She's been looking for a lever." Rosa said, "Cruz is the lever." "Cruz and Briggs," Marco said. "Together, they're the whole chain from Decker down to the county recorder's office." Gerald said, "The land, if the acquisitions were fraudulent..." Marco looked at him. "Every transaction Briggs touched as a material party is going to be reviewed. That's not a promise, but it's how these things work when the fraud is systemic." Patricia sat down. It was the first time she had sat down since she'd gotten up to make coffee 2 hours ago, and the act of sitting had a weight to it. Gerald reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Ethan watched his parents and thought about the letter under the seed catalogs. Then his phone buzzed again. He looked at the screen, the same unknown number. North Road, 2 vehicles. Slow, looking. He showed it to Marco. Marco looked at it and was moving before he finished reading. He said, "Inside, away from windows," and was already at the back door. He stepped out, pulled it quietly behind him. Ethan said, "Everyone to the hallway." Patricia and Gerald moved without argument, which told Ethan something about how the night had shifted the architecture of things in this house. Rosa came with them, and the 4 of them stood in the interior hallway, no windows, 2 walls between them and the road. Ethan went to the kitchen window. Through the gap in the curtain, he could see the county road. 2 sets of headlights moving slow. Much slower than a passing vehicle. The kind of slow that meant looking. They moved past the driveway without turning in. Ethan exhaled. Then the lights stopped. They were 50 yards north of the driveway. Both vehicles just stopped sitting on the road and the dark engines running. He watched. They didn't move. Then the lights cut out entirely. Both of them. That was worse than the slow moving. That was deliberate. That was someone deciding not to be seen. Ethan went to the hallway. He said quietly, "They've stopped north of the driveway. Killed their lights." Marco was at the back door. Ethan could see him through the glass standing just outside his phone to his ear. He'd seen it already or been told. Rosa said, "They're not coming to the door." "Not yet," Ethan said. "What are they doing?" "Waiting," he said, "seeing if anyone moves." Gerald said, "So we don't move." "So we don't move," Ethan agreed. The five of them stood in the hallway and did not move, and the farm did not move, and the darkness held everything in place like something poured and set. 4 minutes, 5. Then Ethan felt more than heard a change in the air outside, a low vibration that wasn't mechanical, exactly more like a pressure, the feeling of mass approaching. Marco came through the back door. He was almost smiling, not happy, but the expression of a man watching a plan arrive on schedule. He said, "Look north." Ethan went to the window. On the county road coming from the north headlights. Not 2, not 10, a line of them extending past the curve, each one precisely spaced, moving at a steady speed. The front of the line was already passing the stopped dark vehicles, and as it did, the dark vehicles' lights came back on, and then went off again, and didn't come back. Marco said from the doorway, 12 of our guys took position in the field north of the road 20 minutes ago. Those vehicles are not going anywhere. Ethan stared at the lights still coming around the curve. How many are out there? Right now on your property and on the road and staged in the fields to the south? Maybe 400. More coming. The main group is still 90 minutes out. They were farther away. 400 at 5:30 in the morning on 40 acres in Iowa. Rosa said from behind Ethan, "He called them before he called me back." Ethan looked at her. She said, "When I called Marco before he answered my questions, before he said anything else, he sent the call out. To everyone." She looked at her son. "You didn't wait to find out how bad it was." Marco said, "I didn't need to." Rosa looked at her son for a long moment, and something passed between them, old and specific, the kind of thing built over years. She said, "Thank you." He said, "Thank me when it's done." She nodded. "When it's done." Gerald Ward said, "What happens now?" Marco came fully back into the kitchen. He pulled out a chair and sat down, not at the head of the table, Ethan noticed, but to the side, as if this were a discussion rather than a command. He looked at Gerald and at Ethan. He said, "Now we wait for first light, and then we go take back what belongs to this county." Gerald said, "Briggs has been the law here for 11 years. Marco said, "He's been wearing the law. That's different." Gerald absorbed this. He said, "What do you need from us?" Marco looked at Ethan. Ethan understood the look. He said, "He needs me to lead them to the quarry." Patricia said, "Ethan," one word, low, everything in it. Ethan looked at his mother. He thought about being 12 years old and taking responsibility for the broken axle on the grain cart, and his mother's expression, then versus the expression on her face now, and the shape of it was the same, but the depth of it was different, the way the same color can look different depending on what's beneath it. He said, "Mom." She said, "I know." A breath. "I know." She looked at Marco. "Is he going to be safe?" Marco said, "Mrs. Ward, I will put myself between your son and anything that moves toward him. That's not something I say. That's something I'm telling you as fact." Patricia Ward looked at Marco Mendoza for a long time. She was taking his measure the way she'd taken Rosa's measure, the way she'd taken the measure of every person who'd ever come to this table with something at stake. She said, "All right." Outside in the growing gray before dawn, the fields were filling up. Ethan Ward stood in his kitchen and felt the weight of 2,000 men arriving at the edge of his land, and he felt the weight of his family's history in this county, and he felt the weight of a woman who'd been in a car trunk and was now sitting at his table drinking his mother's coffee, and he felt underneath all of it, steadier than any of it, the specific gravity of a decision that had already been made back in the ditch when he'd come up the bank with a post driver in his hand and not a single guarantee of anything. He'd made the decision then. Everything else was just what came after. Rosa said, "Get some water. Eat something if you can." She looked at Ethan. "You're going to need it." He went to the cabinet. He got down 4 glasses. He filled them from the tap and brought them to the table and set one in front of each person, and they sat there in the dark kitchen while the world outside got ready for whatever the morning was going to be, and for a few minutes they just drank water and didn't say anything and let the quiet be what it was. Then Marco's phone buzzed. He looked at it. He said, "The FBI contact is 90 minutes out." Rosa said, "She's coming here. She's coming to the staging point, half-mile south." He paused. "She wants Ethan." Everyone looked at Ethan. He said, "Why?" Marco said, "Because you're the witness. You saw them take her from the trunk. You have the gun. You can put Cruz at the scene, and that gives her a warrant by sunrise." Ethan set down his water glass. He said, "And the quarry." Marco said, "The warrant and the quarry happen at the same time. That's the plan." He paused. "If you're in." There it was, not an assumption, a question, actual and specific, and offered with the weight it deserved. Ethan Ward thought about 40 acres instead of 80. He thought about the letter under the seed catalogs. He thought about a woman kicking a seat panel from the inside of a car trunk to create a distraction, the specific courage of someone who'd been reduced to that and hadn't stopped fighting. He said, "I am in." Marco nodded once. Rosa put her hand flat on the table briefly and took it away. And outside on the county road that ran along the east edge of 40 acres in Iowa, the line of lights kept coming one after another, steady and without end. And the sound of them was like nothing Ethan Ward had ever heard, and like something deep in whatever part of a person recognizes the weight of a moment he would never forget. The night was almost done. The morning was going to be something else entirely. The FBI agent's name was Carla Voss, and she arrived at 5:58 in the morning in an unmarked sedan that looked like every other unmarked sedan Ethan had ever seen in a movie, which meant it looked exactly like what it was. She was 44, compact, with dark hair pulled back, and the kind of face that had learned to give nothing away without looking like it was working at it. She shook Ethan's hand in the staging area, a flat gravel turnout half a mile south of the Ward farm, where a dozen bikes and two dark SUVs had arranged themselves with the casual precision of people who did this regularly, and she looked at him with the specific attention of someone whose job was to figure out in the first 30 seconds whether a witness was going to hold. She said, "Tell me exactly what you saw. Start from when you heard the crash." Ethan told her. He didn't embellish and he didn't minimize, and he went in a sequence the way he'd been taught to think through problems since he was old enough to diagnose a failing irrigation line. This happened then this. She listened without interrupting, which he appreciated. She had a small recorder on the hood of the sedan, and she let it run. When he finished, she said, "The gun." He took it from his jacket pocket and held it out barrel down. She took it with a gloved hand, looked at it, bagged it. She said, "You touched the barrel." "I didn't know not to." "It's fine, your prints are on record." "No. We'll print you here right now for elimination." She looked at Marco, who was standing 6 feet away with his arms crossed and in the patient expression of a man who'd done his part and was now waiting on everyone else to catch up. "Cruz, you're sure about the ID?" Marco said, "Photo confirmation from the gas station footage. Cruz was at the rest stop. He was at the road. We have both." Voss said, "That's probable cause for the warrant." She was already on her phone, stepping away, talking in the low-clipped shorthand of someone who spent their life on calls that mattered. Ethan watched her. Marco came to stand beside him. Marco said quietly, "She's good. She's been working Decker's network for almost 2 years. She's not going to drop this." "How do you know, sir?" Marco was quiet for a second. "We've given each other useful information from time to time. Neither of us advertises that." He paused. "Law enforcement and clubs like mine have a complicated relationship." "I've heard. Most of what you've heard is probably accurate and probably incomplete." He glanced at Ethan. "We're not saints. I'm not going to tell you otherwise. But Decker's operation, what he's doing to this county, to families like yours, that's not something I let stand in my territory." Ethan said, "This is your territory." "It's part of it, yes." "For how long?" Marco looked at him steadily. "Long enough that what happened to your family's land happened on my watch. And I didn't know." He said the last 3 words with a flatness that had something underneath it, not guilt exactly, more like the specific anger of a man who took responsibility seriously and had just learned he'd failed at it. "I didn't know because Decker was careful. He used Briggs to keep the legal face clean, and he kept his transactions small enough to stay under the radar. It was your farm. It was the Kowalski place, the Hendersons, small parcels, individual families." Ethan felt something move in his chest. "The Hendersons. You know them?" "Tom Henderson's been farming out here since before I was born. He sold his equipment last fall. We thought he was retiring." Marco said he wasn't retiring. Ethan looked at the ground. 19 families, Marco said. "That's what Voss has documented so far. 19 families in this county who were assessed, pressured, foreclosed, or legally maneuvered off land they'd held for generations. He paused. Yours is one of them. 19. Ethan held the number. He thought about 19 kitchen tables, 19 sets of hands laid flat on wood, 19 letters slid under seed catalogs, or tucked behind cabinet doors, or just left on the table because there was no point in hiding them anymore. He said, "How does a man like Decker think he gets away with this?" "Because men like Decker usually do," Marco said. "Because he bought the one person he needed to own the sheriff, and because land fraud in rural counties is slow and quiet, and nobody's looking hard enough until somebody makes it impossible to look away." Voss came back. She said, "Warrant's being processed. Judge is awake." She looked at Ethan. "I need you on the record for one more thing. The woman in the trunk. What did you see that told you she was in the trunk before they opened it?" Ethan thought back. The third man went to the rear of the crashed vehicle before the other two finished with the front. He didn't check the front, he went straight to the trunk. Like he already knew that was where the cargo was. Voss wrote something. "You used the word cargo. I'm using it now. I didn't think it then. I thought woman. Locked in. I thought that in about 1 second. And that was when you decided to act." "That was when I was already acting." He paused. "I decided before I consciously decided, if that makes sense." Voss looked at him over her notepad. Something shifted in her expression, not warmth, but recognition. She said, "It makes sense." She went back to her phone. Rosa had come down to the staging area in one of the SUVs. She was standing at the edge of the group, talking in a low voice with two men Ethan hadn't seen before, older, both wearing cuts, both with the particular stillness of men who'd earned whatever position they held. She caught Ethan's eye across the gravel and gave him a small nod. He nodded back. Marco's phone went off. He looked at it, and his expression did something specific. Ethan said, "What?" Marco held the phone out. On the screen was a photo, grainy, taken from a distance with a long lens but clear enough. A man coming out of a building, heavy-set 50s, wearing a sheriff's department jacket. Briggs, at the quarry. Marco said, "He got there 40 minutes ago. He's been inside since." He looked at Voss, who'd seen him move, and was already walking over. "Your guy is on site." Voss looked at the photo. She said, "That's him." Not a question. Then, "Who took this?" Marco said, "One of mine, positioned northeast of the quarry access road." Voss looked at Marco with an expression that was careful and complicated. She said, "Your people are at the quarry." "Observing," Marco said, "not engaging. Not until you have your warrant and we have a plan." "And if something happened before I have my warrant?" Marco met her eyes. "Then my people will respond to protect themselves and any civilian in danger." That's the same answer it always is. Voss held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "I need the warrant in 20 minutes or the window closes. Briggs will move before sunrise." She was back on her phone before she finished the sentence. Ethan looked at Marco. "What happens if Briggs moves before the warrant?" Marco said, "Then this gets louder." "Define louder." Marco looked at him, not evasive, just measuring how much detail served the moment. He said, 2,000 people on a county road at 6 in the morning makes noise that doesn't stay local. State police, media, federal escalation. Decker loses his quiet operation the moment this becomes a public event. That's not what you want. What I want is Decker in handcuffs and your family's land back and Briggs in front of a judge. A public event makes 2 of those 3 harder. He paused. But if the warrant doesn't come through, a public event is what he gets. Ethan understood. The warrant was the surgical option. Everything else was the other kind. He said, "Tell me about the quarry, the layout." Marco looked at him. "Why?" "Because I grew up driving past it. Because I've been on the access road twice in the last 2 years when I needed the back way around the county road construction. Because I know where the secondary entrance is that most people don't know about." Marco was very still. Ethan said, "There's a farm track that comes in from the west side. It was a feedlot road before the quarry was operational. My grandfather used it. It joins the quarry property about 300 yards from the main building." He paused. "Nobody who bought that property in the last 4 years would know it's there. It's not on the county parcel map. My grandfather had a handshake agreement with the original quarry owner." Marco said, "Can you find it in low light?" "I've driven it in the dark for the shortcut." Marco said, "Come with me." They went to one of the SUVs where a man was working over a paper map spread across the hood, actual paper Ethan noticed, which told him something about operational security. Marco said something to the man, and the man stepped aside, and Marco looked at Ethan and said, "Show me." Ethan looked at the map. He found the quarry parcel, found the western boundary, found the remnant line of the old feedlot road. It wasn't marked, but the geography was right, and he knew where it would fall relative to the tree line and the creek bend. He put his finger on the map. "Here, the track starts about 40 yards east of this bend. There's a gap in the fence. The original gate was removed, but the posts are still there. You can see the wheel ruts if you know to look." The man who'd was back looking over Marco's shoulder, and he said, "If that's confirmed, that's an approach from a direction they won't be watching." Marco said, "Can you lead a vehicle in on that track?" "Yes. If it's overgrown. I know the line of it. I'll walk ahead if I have to." Marco said, "You won't have to walk." Voss came back at a pace that said something had changed. She said, "Warrant signed. Judge signed it 6 minutes ago. It covers the quarry property, Briggs, Cruz, and any associate present." She looked at Marco. "I need 10 minutes to coordinate federal units. I have 4 agents staged 2 miles east." Marco said, "Tell them to hold on the east road. We have an approach from the west that changes the geometry." Voss looked at him. He gestured at Ethan. Voss looked at Ethan. Ethan said, "There's a secondary access that Decker's people won't be covering. A farm track on the west side. I know where it is." Voss said, "You're not law enforcement." No, you can't be part of an enforcement action. I can lead you to the gate and step back." She looked at Marco. Marco said, "He leads us to the western entrance. That's it. Then he's out." Voss was quiet for 3 seconds. 4. She had the face of someone running a calculation that involved more variables than she'd planned for when she woke up this morning, which was presumably before 4 a.m., which meant her day had already been very long. She said, "Fine, but when I say stop, you stop." Ethan said, "Understood." Voss said, "We move in 8 minutes." She walked back to her sedan. Rosa was at Ethan's elbow. Before he registered, she'd moved. She said, "You know what you're doing?" He said, "I know the land. The rest is their job." She studied him. "Are you scared?" He thought about it honestly. He said, "Yes." "Good," she said. "Scared is honest. Scared keeps you from doing something stupid." She paused. "Do you know what the difference is between a scared person and a brave one?" He shook his head. She said, "Nothing. They're the same person. One just moved first." He looked at her. She said, "You moved first, back in that ditch." Her voice had dropped to something quieter, something that wasn't Rosa Mendoza managing a situation, but was something closer to what was underneath that. "I want you to understand something, Ethan. I've been around men who called themselves hard my entire adult life. Men with patches and reputations and records. Men who talked about courage like it was something they own." She paused. Very few of them would have come up that bank. He didn't know what to do with that, so he just said, "You were in the trunk." "Yes," she said, "I was." And she said it like it meant what it meant, and also like it meant everything else. The fact that she'd been there, the fact that he'd seen it, and acted the fact that the two of them were standing in a gravel lot in the gray light of a morning that was rewriting itself every few minutes. She put her hand on his arm briefly, then she stepped back. Marco was there. He said, "She stays here." Rosa said, "I know." Marco looked at her. She said, "I know, Marco. I'm not getting in a vehicle. I'm staying with Gerald and Patricia until it's done." She looked at her son with the steady precision of a woman who understood exactly what she was asking. "Finish it." Marco said, "Yes." He looked at Ethan. "Let's go." They moved in a 3-vehicle formation. Voss in the lead sedan with one of her agents, Ethan, in the middle vehicle with Marco and 2 others, a 3rd truck behind them. Behind the trucks, Ethan knew without seeing other people were moving into position from other directions. The East Road, the main quarry access, the county road approach. He didn't know the numbers or the exact positions, but he understood the geometry. They were closing a shape, and he was the piece that finished the western edge. The drive took 11 minutes at the speed they ran it. Nobody spoke much. Marco was on his phone low and constant coordinating. The agent in the passenger seat had something in his ear. Ethan sat in the back and watched the road and felt the fear that Rosa had correctly identified and Breathe through it the way you breathed through the bad moment. When a piece of equipment failed in a way that could go worse, controlled. Exhale, next problem. Stay functional. He thought about 19 families. He thought about Tom Henderson selling his equipment in the fall with a look on his face that Ethan had read as tired and now understood as something else entirely. He thought about the letter under the seed catalogs. He thought about his mother sitting down in the kitchen at 4 a.m, the first time she'd sat down, and what that sitting down had cost her to let happen in front of people she'd only just met. The vehicle slowed. Marco said, "This is where you direct." Ethan leaned forward between the seats and looked at the road ahead. He found the creek bend in the gray morning light barely visible, but he knew the angle of it, the way the grade changed just before it. He said, "Slow down," 40 yards past the bend, on the right. They crept forward. Ethan said, "Here, stop." They stopped. He got out before the vehicle had fully settled and walked to the fence line. The posts were there, gray wood, old. The original gate hardware, still bolted to the right post, rusted into permanence. The gap between them was wide enough for a vehicle with room to spare. The wheel ruts were there in the soil, barely visible under 2 seasons of grass growth, but there. He knew what he was looking at. He turned back to this vehicle and said, "Here's the gate. The track runs northeast from here about 300 yards. It curves left before it hits the main property. The curve is blind from the main building." Marco was out of the vehicle. He came to the gap and looked. He said into his phone, "West entrance confirmed. 300 yards to the main structure. We're going in." He listened for a second, then, "East team holds until we're at the curve. Voss, you copy." From the sedan, Voss, copy. Federal team is moving on the main access. Coordinate timing. Marco said, 2 minutes from now, everyone moves at the same time. He looked at Ethan. Ethan said, "I'll walk point to the curve. After that, I'm back." Marco said, "Agreed." Voss appeared at Ethan's shoulder. She said, "Mr. Ward, this is where your involvement ends after the curve." He said, "I understand." She looked at him for a moment. "What you did tonight at the road and here it matters. I want you to know that." He nodded. She said, "When this is over, I'm going to need a full written statement." He said, "You'll have it." She almost smiled. Almost. Then she was back to what she was. Marco said, "Move." Ethan went through the gap in the fence posts first. He found the line of the old track by feel and memory, and the small signs that someone who'd grown up around worked land knew to read the compression of the soil where vehicles had repeatedly passed. The way the grass grew differently over disturbed ground, the angle of the ruts relative to the fence line. He walked it at a steady pace, not fast, because fast on unknown ground in low light was how you twisted an ankle and became a liability, and he was not going to be a liability. Behind him, the vehicles came through the gap one by one. The sound of them was controlled engines at low throttle, deliberate, not silent, but not what they would have heard from the main access road. Ethan walked. 200 yards. 250. He felt the track curve left the way he'd remembered it, the grade falling slightly toward the quarry floor. He stopped. He held up his hand without turning around, and the vehicle behind him stopped. He could hear voices now, not clear, too far, too low, but voices. In a generator, the specific grind of a large one running steady. And something else. Something he placed after a second radio. The tinny crackle of a two-way radio being used. They were there. People were there, awake, active. He turned back to Marco, who'd gotten out of the vehicle and was 2 steps behind him. Ethan pointed left and held up 3 fingers. 300 yards roughly to the main structure, based on where they were, and then made a flat palm gesture. The curve was here. Marco nodded. Then Marco's phone buzzed. He looked at it, and his expression went tight. He turned it to face Ethan. The text was from one of the observation positions. It said, "Crews visible. Main entrance. Armed. He knows something's wrong." Ethan felt his stomach drop. Marco was already typing back. "How long?" A few seconds, then the reply. "He's been on his radio for 4 minutes. Pacing." Something had tipped them, or almost tipped them, or Ethan thought fast, maybe Crew's arm was making him paranoid. A broken arm at the road, his people came back without the package in the dark hours before dawn. The math of that added up to exposure, and a man who understood exposure would feel it coming even without a specific warning. Marco said very quietly to Voss, who'd appeared at his other shoulder, "Cruz is reactive. He's not confirmed, but he's moving." Voss said, "We can't wait." Marco said, "Agreed." Into his phone. "All positions. Move now. Don't wait for the 2-minute mark. Move now." And then everything happened at once. From the east, the sound of vehicles, multiple fast, the federal team coming up the main access road, without pretense, now moving at speed. From where Ethan stood, Marco's two vehicles went from idle to moving past Ethan around the curve and out of his sight. Shouts, distant, then immediate. The specific sharp quality of commands being given by multiple people, simultaneously law enforcement commands of the kind designed to cut through noise and confusion and land in the body before the mind catches up. Ethan stood at the curve in the feedlot road. He had been told this was where he stopped. He stopped. He stood in the gray morning and listened to what was happening 40 yards away and around a bend in the ground, and he breathed and he did not move forward, and that was one of the harder things he'd done in a night that had not been short on hard things. The radio crackle he'd heard earlier stopped. The generator kept running. More shouts. A crash, something, large metal tipping or being pushed. Then a specific sound that Ethan had only ever heard in his life, twice before, both times at a distance, both times on the county road, when there'd been incidents he'd only heard about secondhand. A gunshot, then another, then nothing. 15 seconds of nothing, which was its own kind of sound. Then Voss's voice clear and carrying, "Federal agent, do not move, do not move." More voices. The ground-level confusion of a position being taken, people being directed, the specific procedural noise of law enforcement doing what it trained for. And then Marco's voice closer coming back around the curve. "It's done." Ethan turned. Marco was walking toward him. His expression was focused and had the residual heat of the last few minutes in it, not calm exactly, but post-action, the face of a man on the other side of a threshold. He said, "Briggs is in custody. Cruz is in custody. Two of Decker's men went for their weapons and were stopped." He said stopped in a way that covered whatever that meant without going into detail. "Nobody on our side, nobody on Voss's side." Ethan said Decker. Marco's jaw tightened. "Not here. He wasn't at the quarry." "No." He said it like it tasted bad. "Briggs and Cruz were running the ground operation. Decker operates from a distance. He has a main residence outside the county, Voss knows where." He paused. "This doesn't end here, but it starts here." Ethan stood with that. Marco said, "You should know in the main building, the documents." He paused and his expression did something specific. "The transaction records, the parcel maps, the correspondence between Briggs and Decker." He looked at Ethan. "Your family's land is in there. The fraudulent assessment, the sale records. All of it documented in Decker's own hand, because men like Decker document everything because they believe they're never going to get caught." Ethan didn't say anything. Marco said, "Voss is going to have what she needs to unwind every transaction, every forced sale, every fraudulent assessment." Ethan felt something move through him. Not triumph, too complicated for that. Something more like the feeling when a weight you've been carrying for so long you stop noticing it begins just slightly to shift. He said the South 40. Marco said, "I don't know how long it takes legally. I won't make you a promise about timeline. But the case is there." He paused. "Voss told me before she moved off the record that this is the cleanest land fraud documentation she's seen in 20 years. Ethan said because Decker thought he was safe. Marco said yes. A federal agent came around the curve and spoke to Voss, who'd appeared from somewhere, and the two of them went back around together in the efficient, purposeful way of people managing a scene. Ethan looked at Marco. He said, "Your mother, she knew. When she called you from the kitchen, she knew that what she was calling down on this county would be bigger than just getting her back." Marco met his eyes. "She has a long view. She called from a stranger's house in the middle of the night and trusted that we weren't going to make things worse for her." "She trusted what she saw," Marco said. "She read you. She reads people very fast and very accurately. It's one of the things that's kept her safe her whole life." He paused. "She read you in about 90 seconds. Ethan thought about that. He thought about Rosa looking at him across the kitchen table with the weighing expression that had eventually, at some point he couldn't quite pin down, stopped weighing. He said, "What did she see?" Marco said, "Somebody who did the right thing when the right thing was the hard thing, and nobody would have blamed him for doing nothing." He paused. That's rarer than it sounds. The gray morning was moving towards something that could almost be called light. From back down the feedlot track, another set of headlights appeared. More vehicles, more of Marco's people coming in now that the position was taken and secure. The controlled, organized movement of a force that was still managing its own geometry even after the action was done. Ethan looked at the headlights and thought about the line of lights on the county road and the number 2000 and what it meant that all of those people had come, had moved, had positioned themselves in the dark on 40 acres of Iowa farmland because one phone call had gone out and everyone who received it had understood without needing it, explained what answering it meant. He said, the men in the two dark vehicles, the ones who stopped north of our driveway. Marco said, Decker's people. They've been detained, 2 of them. They'll be processed with the rest. He looked at Ethan. They were watching your house. I know. They knew someone had helped Rosa. I figured. Which means they would have come to your door eventually. Ethan said, I know that too. He looked at the ground. He looked at the gray sky. He thought about his parents in the kitchen in the dark, and the particular specific courage it took to sit still in your own house while something moved outside that you couldn't fully see or understand, and how that courage was different from the kind you needed at the end of a ditch bank, but not lesser. He said, I need to get back to them. Marco nodded. I'll take you. They walked back down the feedlot track together. The vehicles that had come around the bend were repositioning people moving with the focused efficiency of the aftermath. Nobody looked at Ethan with curiosity or assessment. They looked at him the way they'd look at someone who was supposed to be there, which was its own very specific thing. At the fence gap, Marco stopped. He said, there's something I want to say. Ethan waited. Marco looked at him. My mother has never called for help. In her entire life, she solved every problem she's encountered with her own resources, her own judgment, her own relationships. I have never in my life gotten a call from her that said she was in trouble. He paused. Last night was the first time. Ethan understood what that meant. Marco said, she called me and the first thing she said was her name and that she was safe, and the second thing she said was your name, before she told me anything about what happened, before she gave me the location. He paused again. She said there's a young man here. His name is Ethan Ward. She said it like it was the most important piece of information she had. Ethan felt something in his throat. Marco said it was. They stood at the fence gap for a moment. Then Marco said, come on. Let's go tell your family what happened. They went through the hum and back to the vehicles and drove back toward 40 acres of Iowa corn in the early morning, where 2,000 people were waiting and where a kitchen table with a rooster salt shaker and a stack of letters that didn't need to be hidden anymore was still sitting exactly where it had always been. They came back to the farm as the sun broke the horizon. Not metaphorically the actual sun, actual horizon though, specific moment when the gray dissolved and the first hard line of gold came over the tree line to the east and hit everything it touched and changed the color of the world. Ethan saw it through the windshield of Marco's vehicle as they turned off the county road onto the farm drive, and he thought that in 23 years of waking up on this land, he had never seen that particular light look the way it looked this morning, which was the same as it always was and completely different. The farm was not quiet. He'd understood intellectually what 2,000 people meant. He'd done the math during the drive back, run the number against the 40 acres, thought about the county road and the field road and the staging areas Marco had mentioned. He'd told himself he was prepared for what he'd find when they pulled in. He was not prepared. The county road in both directions was lined with motorcycles so densely that it looked like a different kind of geography. A long double ridge of chrome and steel and leather that extended north past where he could see and south past the curve. The field road had bikes parked in it, 3 abreast. The gravel around the barn was covered. The yard between the barn and the house had men in it, standing or sitting or crouched against the barn wall, and none of them were loud. None of them were chaotic. They were just present in the specific weighty way of a force that knew its own size. Marco's vehicle pulled into the yard and stopped, and Marco got out like this was an ordinary morning, which told Ethan something about what extraordinary looked like from the inside when you'd lived there long enough. Ethan got out. 50 faces turned toward him. Then more. The movement spread outward from the vehicle, the way a ripple spreads from a stone, not fast, not dramatic, just the organic shift of attention that happens when a crowd registers something. Men who'd been talking stopped talking. Men who'd been looking at their phones stopped looking. They looked at Ethan Ward, 23 years old, work boots with fraying laces, standing in his own yard in the early morning light. Nobody said anything. Then someone somewhere in the group near the barn started it. Not a cheer, not the stadium sound, something lower, something that started in the chest. Hands coming together, slow and deliberate, and it built from the barn out across the yard and down toward the road. And it wasn't wild, it wasn't performed. It was the sound of 200 men in the immediate area doing one single thing together, and the weight of it landed on Ethan like something physical. He didn't know what to do with it. He stood there and felt it, and looked at the ground briefly, and looked up and gave a single nod, which seemed like all that was appropriate and also like the only thing he was capable of. Marco beside him said quietly, "They know what you did." Ethan said, "How?" Word moves fast in a group this size, it always has. He paused. "They know you pulled a woman out of a car trunk alone in the dark." That's the part that travels. The back door of the house opened, and Patricia Ward came out, and she looked at the yard full of men and didn't flinch because Patricia Ward did not flinch. And she found her son's face in the crowd, and something went out of her when she saw him, some tension, some held thing, and she came across the yard and took his face in both hands briefly, the way she'd done when he was a child coming home from something that had scared her. She said, "You're all right." He said, "I'm all right." She dropped her hands. She straightened. She looked at Marco. She said, "Is it done?" Marco said, "Briggs is in federal custody. Cruz is in federal custody. Decker's quarry operation has been seized." He paused. "Decker himself is still at large, but the FBI has him located and there's a federal warrant active." Patricia absorbed this the way she absorbed everything, not quickly, not carelessly, but with the specific methodical attention of someone who needed to understand exactly what she'd been told before she let herself respond to it. She said, "The land." Marco said, "The fraud documentation is in federal hands. Every transaction is going to be reviewed." Patricia said, "Our South 40. Marco met her eyes. "I won't make you a promise about how long it takes, but the basis for recovery is there. It's solid." Patricia Ward stood in her yard with 200 men behind Ethan and roughly 2,000 on her county road, and she was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Then she said, "All right." She looked at Marco. "Have your people eaten?" Marco looked at her. She said, 2,000 people on my road since before dawn. Have they eaten?" Marco said slowly, "Mrs. Ward." Patricia, we're not asking you to." "You're not asking," she said. "I'm telling." She looked at Ethan. "Get me numbers. How many are we talking about right now on this property?" Ethan looked at Marco. Marco said, "On the property and immediate road, maybe 400. The rest are staged south on the county road and in the Henderson's old lot." Patricia said, 400. She calculated something. "I'm going to need to make calls." She was already turning back toward the house. Rosa appeared in the doorway. She'd been inside, she'd stayed inside as Marco had asked, and she'd clearly been watching through the window because her expression, when she saw Marco and Ethan together in the yard, had the specific quality of someone who'd been tracking a situation through the glass for the last hour and was now seeing the resolution arrive in person. She came down the steps. Marco went to her. They didn't do the thing from the kitchen again. That had been the first moment of the relief moment, and they were both past that now. This was different. He stood in front of her and said quietly, "It's done." And she looked at him for a long moment and said, "Briggs, in custody. Cruz, in custody. 2 of Decker's men are dead. They drew weapons." Rosa took that in. "Decker, still out. Warrants active. Voss has his location." Rosa's jaw moved. He knew. Marco said, "What do you mean?" He knew something was going to happen. He wasn't there. She said it with the flat tone of a woman running a post-mortem in real time. "He pulled back before we moved. Someone told him." Marco said, or he felt it coming, "He's been running this operation for 4 years without getting caught. Men like that develop instincts." Rosa said, "Or he has someone inside." The word inside landed in the air between them, and Ethan felt the temperature of the conversation change. Marco said, "Inside where?" Rosa said, "Voss's operation." Think about it. He had reached into the county sheriff's office. Why not further? Marco was very still. He said, "That's a serious." "Everything about this is serious," Rosa said. "I was in a car trunk. The serious threshold was crossed some time ago." Marco looked at her for a moment. Then he took out his phone and stepped away. Rosa turned to Ethan. She said, "You led them to the quarry." "I showed them the back entrance, that's all." "That's not all," she said. "The back entrance meant they came in from a direction Cruz wasn't covering. That's why nobody on our side got hurt." She paused. "That matters more than it sounds." Ethan said, "It was just a farm track." "It was the right farm track at the right moment," Rosa said. "Stop minimizing. It's an unattractive habit in an otherwise capable young man." He almost laughed. Not quite, but close. Gerald came out of the barn. He'd been inside. Ethan understood keeping himself useful, the way Gerald Ward always kept himself useful, when he didn't have clear instructions, because standing still cost him something. He looked at the yard, looked at Marco on the phone, looked at Ethan. He said, "It went all right," Ethan said. "It went all right." Gerald nodded. He looked at the line of bikes on the county road visible through the gate. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know what I keep thinking about?" Ethan shook his head. Gerald said Tom Henderson, and Ethan said, "Yeah. He's going to need to know. All of them are. The 19 families." Gerald's voice was even, but underneath it was the specific anger of a man who'd thought his losses were bad weather, and now understood they were theft, and who was working out the difference between those two things in real time. They didn't lose their land to drought or debt. They lost it to a man who bought the person who was supposed to protect them. Rosa said, "They'll know. When the federal case is public, they'll all know." Gerald said, "That's not enough." Rosa looked at him. Gerald said, "Knowing doesn't give anyone their land back. Knowing doesn't give Tom Henderson his equipment back. He sold everything." His voice stayed level, but the level cost him something. "He sold his grandfather's tractor." Nobody spoke. Then Rosa said, "No, knowing isn't enough. That's correct." She paused. "But it's the beginning of enough. And beginnings matter." Gerald looked at her for a long moment. He was taking her measure again, not the first-time measure of 3 hours ago, but the updated version, the measure you take of someone after you've seen them under pressure and in the aftermath. He said, "You've dealt with people like Decker before." Rosa said, "Yes." "What happens to them?" She said, "The careful ones last a long time because careful covers a lot of damage. But the careful ones eventually make one mistake that they can't cover, and when they do, everything they were careful about comes up at once." She paused. "Decker made his mistake last night when his men put me in a trunk instead of delivering a message or a threat the usual way. He escalated beyond what his protection could manage." Gerald said, "You were the mistake." Rosa said, "I tend to be for men who underestimate the variable they're dealing with." Gerald Ward almost smiled. Marco came back. He said, "Voss is moving on Decker's residence. State police coordinating." She said, he paused, chose words. "She said to tell you it's being handled." Rosa said, "Did she say anything else?" Marco said, "She said the inside concern is being taken seriously and she's managing her information flow." He looked at his mother. "She heard you." Rosa said, "Good." Ethan's phone buzzed. "Boss is on." He looked at it, an actual call, this time full signal, now that the sun was up and whatever atmospheric thing killed his signal before dawn had resolved. The screen said a local number he didn't know. He answered. A man's voice, older, rough at the edges. "Is this the Ward place?" Ethan said. "Yes." "This is Dave Kowalski. I farm out on Route 9. I've been sitting on my porch since about 3 this morning, watching bikes go past on the county road. My wife thinks I'm losing my mind." A pause. "I heard Briggs was arrested." Ethan said, "Where did you hear that?" "Scanner," Kowalski said. "I've had a scanner since 1987, and I've never heard anything like what came over it this morning." Another pause. "Is it true about the assessments, about what they were doing?" Ethan looked at Gerald. Gerald had heard. He came over and stood by his son's shoulder. Ethan said into the phone, "Yes, it's true." Silence on the line. Long enough that Ethan thought the call had dropped. Then Kowalski said, "I lost my east parcel 3 years ago. I thought it was the drought years catching up." His voice had changed. Something in it had broken open quietly, the way something breaks when it's been held together under pressure for a very long time. I thought it was my fault. Ethan said, "It wasn't your fault, Mr. Kowalski." Another silence. Kowalski said, "Who do I call about the land? Who do I call Mom?" Ethan said, "There's an FBI agent named Voss. I'll get you her contact." He got it from Marco and gave it to Kowalski, and the man on the other end of the phone said thank you in the voice of someone who hadn't said that word in a long time and meant it as much as a word could be meant. Then the line went quiet. Ethan stood with his phone in his hand. He said he thought it was his fault. Nobody answered that right away. Then Rosa said, "That's what they count on. That's always what they count on. That the person who was wronged will spend their energy blaming themselves instead of looking outward. It keeps people isolated. It keeps them quiet." Her voice was steady but had heat underneath it. "Decker's real crime isn't the land, it's that." Gerald said, "The land is real enough." "Yes," Rosa said, "both things are true." Marco was looking at his phone. He said, "Voss just sent an update." He read it and his expression moved through something. They picked up Decker. The yard went quiet. Not that anyone outside the immediate circle had heard, but something in the way Marco said it must have carried because the men nearest them stopped what they were doing. Rosa said, "Where?" "Trying to cross into Nebraska, state line." Marco looked up from the phone. He had 2 bags packed and 200,000 in cash and a passport that wasn't his name. He paused. He thought he had time. Gerald said he didn't. Marco said no, he didn't. The thing that had been sitting at the center of the last several hours, not resolved, yet not gone, but present and pressing, shifted. Ethan felt it move, not gone, not over in any clean final sense, but changed. The shape of the morning had changed. He said, "What happens now for today, I mean, practically?" Marco said, "Federal processing, evidence chain from the quarry. Voss will be in depositions most of the day. Briggs and Cruz are being transferred to federal holding." He looked around the yard. "Our people will stand down gradually. It takes time to move a group this size without creating traffic problems on a rural road." Ethan said, "How long?" Marco said, "Most of the day. Some will stay longer, not on your property, not without your consent, but nearby, until the situation is formally stable." Ethan said, "They can stay." Marco looked at him. Ethan said, "This is still my family's land. We decide who's welcome on it." Marco said, "Yes, it is." Patricia appeared at the back door again. She said, "I've made calls. The church women from First Methodist are bringing food. The grain co-op is donating coffee and supplies. I told them we need enough for 400. She looked at Marco. "Is that still the right number for the immediate area?" Marco said, "That's right." Patricia said, "Good." She looked at Ethan. "I need you to set up the long tables from the barn in the yard." He said, "Mom." "The tables," she said, "from the barn, now." He went and got the tables. It took him and 3 men he'd never met before, a man named Pete, who was from Davenport and had forearms like bridge cable, a man named Salazar, who didn't say much but worked efficiently, and a young man about Ethan's age named Decker. Not the Decker, just the name who made a pained face when he introduced himself and said, "Yeah, I know. Terrible timing on the name. My grandmother picked it." Together, they carried 4 long folding tables out of the barn and set them up in the yard, and Patricia came out with tablecloths, which Ethan had not expected, and which seemed to him both entirely typical of his mother and also deeply right. Rosa helped with the tablecloths. She and Patricia moved around the tables together without discussion, the efficient, wordless coordination of 2 women who both understood that a table set properly was not a small thing, that it was in fact a declaration of something, and that the declaration mattered. Gerald watched them for a moment. Then he went back into the barn and came out with 2 more chairs. By 7:30, the church women had arrived with trays, and the co-op truck had pulled up with coffee urns, and the yard of the Ward farm had become something Ethan didn't have an exact word for. Not a party, not a ceremony, something older than both. Men who had ridden through the night to get here stood at folding tables with coffee and paper cups and food that had been made by women who woke up when Patricia Ward called and said there were people who needed feeding, and they ate, and they talked in low voices, and the county road behind them was still lined with bikes, but the bikes were quieter now in the morning light, less like a force and more like a fact. Ethan sat on the porch step with his own coffee. Rosa came and sat beside him. Not in the house, not at the table on the step where he was. She said, "You look tired." He said, I've been awake since 4:45. She said, I've been awake since yesterday afternoon. He looked at her. She said, they picked me up at a rest stop outside Ames at around 3 p.m. yesterday. I was in the trunk for a while. He said, you didn't tell us that. She said, there wasn't a useful moment for it. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. I knew where I was going broadly. I'd heard Decker's name in the context of the Iowa operation. I was coming to talk to Marco about it. I'd gotten information from a contact that the county angle was escalating. They must have had someone watching the highways. Ethan said they were watching for you specifically. Yes, because you were coming to do something about what they were doing. Yes, he thought about that. He thought about a woman who'd spent what sounded like an uncomfortable number of hours in a car trunk, not because of anything she'd done to Decker personally, but because of what she intended to do about what he'd done to 19 families she'd never met. He said, you were trying to help people you didn't know. She said, the families in this county. She shrugged, small, not dismissive, just precise. People like yours. He said, why? She looked at him. Why, you didn't know us. Rosa Mendoza turned her coffee cup in her hands. She was quiet for a moment in the way she was quiet when she was choosing precision over speed. She said, my husband grew up on a farm, not in Iowa, New Mexico. Small operation, his family had worked it for 3 generations. When he was 19, a development company worked through a local official to force a fraudulent tax lien and took the land. She paused. He never stopped being angry about it, not in a way that ruined him, but in a way that was always there. That shaped who he was. Ethan said, what happened to him? He died 11 years ago, she said. He lived long enough to build something, the club, the chapter, the network that had the capacity to prevent exactly the kind of thing that happened to his family from happening to someone else's. She paused. He would not have accepted a world where Decker operated in his territory and he didn't know. And you made sure that world didn't exist. She said, I tried to, and then I ended up in a car trunk, which is the risk you take when you move against someone like Decker before you've got everything in place. Her voice was even, but there was something wry at the edges of it. I made a mistake. I moved too fast without enough cover. Ethan said, if you hadn't been on that road last night, she said, you would have gotten up this morning and driven past a quarry that had been running a fraud operation for 4 years, and you wouldn't have known what was in it, and Decker would have kept going till there were no more families left to pressure. He said, so you being in the trunk was accidental, she said, inconsequential. Both. She looked at him. That's how most important things are. Marco came around the side of the house and stopped when he saw them on the step. He looked at his mother and at Ethan and at the yard full of men and tables and coffee, and he said, Voss wants to brief you, both of you, when you're ready. Rosa said, give us 10 minutes. Marco looked at Ethan. Ethan said 10 minutes. Marco went back around the house. Rosa said, when this is over, the federal process, the land review, all of it, your family is going to face some things. Reporters, people with questions. The county is going to be in upheaval for a while because when you pull out a thread like Briggs and its structural things come apart in ways people don't expect. Ethan said, I know. You're going to be asked to tell this story a lot. I know. She said, tell it straight. Don't let anyone make it bigger than it was or smaller. It was what it was. A man heard a sound he didn't understand and went toward it instead of away. She paused. Let that be the story. He said, what are you going to do after? She said, go home, talk to Marco, talk to our people about what we missed about this county and why we missed it. She paused. Make sure Tom Henderson and Dave Kowalski and the other 17 families have whatever support we can offer while the legal process runs. She said it matter-of-factly, as if this were obvious, as if the decision had been made long before this morning. He said, you're going to help them. She said, we're going to help them. That's different. He looked at her. She said, you're part of this now, Ethan, not because of obligation, because of what you did. That's its own category. She held his gaze. The people whose land was taken are your neighbors. You know their names, you know their farms. When the lawyers start their work and the federal case starts its process, someone local who people trust is going to need to stand with those families and help them understand what's happening. He said, that's about a big ask. She said, yes, and I'm not asking. I'm telling you what I think you're going to do anyway, Because I've been watching you since you pulled me out of that ditch, and everything I've seen tells me that's who you are. He looked at the yard. He looked at his father carrying a chair from one table to another, talking to Pete from Davenport like they'd known each other for years. He looked at his mother pouring coffee from a cardboard tray into paper cups with the unhurried competence of a woman who fed people as a primary expression of who she was. He looked at 40 acres that could become 80 again. He said, "All right." Rosa said, "All right." They sat on the step for 3 more minutes and drank their coffee and didn't say anything else because they'd said what needed saying, and the morning was doing its own work around them, all that light and people, and the low, steady sound of something that had been wrong beginning to come right. Then Rosa stood. She straightened her jacket. She became Rosa Mendoza again, fully, completely, all of it present. She said, "Let's go hear what Voss has to say." Ethan stood. They walked across the yard together, and the men near them made room, and the morning held everything it had been given to hold, and 40 acres of Iowa soil sat in the early sun and waited for what came next. Voss set up in the barn. Not the house, the barn, because the barn had a workbench long enough to spread documents on, and because 4 federal agents and Marco and Rosa and Ethan and Gerald Ward in a farmhouse kitchen would have been a geometry problem without a solution. She had a laptop and a portable printer that one of her agents had pulled from the trunk of the sedan, and she had a stack of documents that had come out of the quarry building in evidence bags and been photographed and cleared for briefing use in the time it took everyone to drink their first cup of coffee. She stood at the head of the workbench and looked at the people around it and said, "Here's where we are." She said it without preamble, without the bureaucratic windup that Ethan had expected from a federal agent running a briefing. Just here's where we are. He appreciated that. Decker is in federal custody as of 6:42 this morning. He was apprehended at the Nebraska state line with falsified identification cash and a phone containing approximately 4 months of encrypted communications that our tech team is already working through. She paused. He said nothing when arrested. He's had legal representation waiting on standby, which tells you how long he's been preparing for this possibility. Marco said he knew it was coming eventually. Men like Decker always do, Voss said. That's why they build exit plans. What they don't always build is an exit plan that accounts for the other side moving faster than expected. She looked at Ethan briefly. He had about 3 hours between when his men lost contact at the road and when we hit the quarry. In those 3 hours, he packed and ran. But 3 hours isn't enough when you're trying to disappear cleanly. Gerald said, "What about Briggs?" Voss said, "Briggs is talking." The barn went quiet. Marco said, "Since when?" "Since approximately 90 minutes ago." He asked for a deal before his attorney finished the first sentence. Voss's voice was even, not triumphant, just factual. He's been building toward this for 4 years. Men like Briggs, they're not true believers, they're opportunists. The moment the structure collapses, they calculate the best position for themselves. She paused. He's giving us everything. The transaction records the assessment manipulation process, the names of every county official who took money from Decker's operation. Gerald said, "How many officials?" Voss said. "So far the sheriff, 2 county commissioners, the chief assessor, and a clerk in the recorder's office." She let that land. It was systemic. It wasn't one person going rogue. It was a coordinated purchase of an entire county's administrative infrastructure. Ethan thought about 19 families. He thought about the math of that, how many people it took to run a fraud that touched 19 separate property transactions over 4 years without triggering an investigation. How many hands it passed through. How many people said yes when they should have said no and took money that wasn't theirs to take. He said 19 families. Voss looked at him. He said, "That's the number you told Marco. 19 families with documented fraudulent transactions." "That's the confirmed number as of this morning," she said. "The full review may surface more." Gerald's hands went flat on the workbench, the same way they'd gone flat on the kitchen table in the dark at 5 a.m. Ethan recognized the gesture. Now it was his father's way of steadying himself, when what he was hearing was too large to absorb standing free. Gerald said, "What does recovery look like for the land?" Voss said, "I'm going to be honest with you, Mr. Ward, because you've earned that and because false hope serves nobody." She opened a folder. "The legal pathway for land recovery in cases of documented fraud is real, and it's been used. It requires civil action running parallel to the criminal case. The federal conviction establishes the fraud, and then the civil case uses that conviction as its foundation to reverse the transactions. She paused. It takes time. It is not fast. In cases, I've worked 18 months to 3 years depending on complexity. Gerald said 3 years. In the most complex cases, some go faster. She looked at him directly. But Mr. Ward, the documentation we pulled from that quarry is extraordinary. Decker kept records of everything, every assessment manipulation, every payment to Briggs, every transaction. He kept them because he needed to manage his own operations finances and because he believed he was untouchable. She paused. That documentation is the foundation of every civil recovery case for every family in this county. It's already there. We don't have to build it. We just have to use it. Gerald absorbed this. He looked at his hands. He said, Tom Henderson sold his grandfather's tractor. Voss said, I know. Can you get that back? Voss said, the tractor itself, I don't know. That depends on who bought it and what trail it left. But the value, the financial loss, the damages, those are part of the civil claim. She paused. I want to be honest, land recovery and financial restitution are not guaranteed. What is guaranteed is that we will pursue every legal avenue available, and that Decker's assets, which are considerable, are being frozen as of this morning. Rosa, who had been standing slightly apart, said, what does Decker's asset base look like? Voss looked at her. Rosa said ballpark. Voss said the operation in this county alone was generating significant cash flow through the land acquisitions and the secondary operations running through the quarry. His overall network, which this county was one node of, is being assessed by a financial crimes unit, but we're talking about a substantial number. Rosa said substantial enough to fund civil recovery for 19 families. Voss said if the civil cases are successful and restitution is ordered, the asset freeze means there's something to collect from. She paused. That's not nothing. That's actually the piece that's usually missing. Rosa said, then it's not nothing. Marco was looking at his mother. He said, you're thinking about the legal fund. Rosa said, I'm thinking that 19 families in a rural Iowa county don't have the resources to run civil litigation against a multi-county fraud operation for 2 years, and that someone with the capacity to fill that gap should consider filling it. Marco said, that's a significant commitment. Rosa said yes. Marco held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, I'll make the calls. Gerald Ward looked up from his hands. He looked at Rosa. He looked at Marco. His expression moved through several things and arrived somewhere that Ethan had no exact word for. It was past gratitude, past relief in some territory that didn't have common currency. He said, you don't have to do that. Rosa said, we know. Gerald said, why would you? Rosa said, Mr. Ward. She said it quietly, but with a weight that stopped him. My husband grew up on a farm that was taken from his family through fraud. He spent his entire adult life building something large enough that it couldn't happen to the people in his territory without consequence. She paused. He's gone. What he built isn't, and the thing he built exists precisely for this moment. She looked at Gerald steadily. Let us do what we're here to do. Gerald looked at her for a long time. Then he said, thank you. 2 words. Undecorated, everything in them. Rosa nodded once. Voss said, there's one more thing, and it involves Ethan. Everyone looked at Ethan. Voss opened another folder. She said, in the quarry documents, there's a communication from Briggs to Decker dated 6 weeks ago. It references a pending assessment on the Ward North acreage, a second manipulated assessment larger than the first designed to trigger a forced sale within 90 days. She looked at Ethan. If last night hadn't happened, your family would have received that assessment in the mail within the next 2 weeks. Ethan stood very still. Voss said, you were next. Your family was the next target. The barn was completely quiet. Even the sounds from outside, the low murmur of men, the occasional engine seemed to pull back from the walls of this specific moment. Gerald said slowly, they were coming for the North 40. Voss said, with the North 40 secured, the Ward farm, as a viable operating entity, would have been effectively finished. The debt load from 2 fraudulent assessments on top of the existing obligations. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Ethan thought about the letter under the seed catalogs. He thought about the specific way his mother's face had looked when she'd slid it under there, not hiding it from him. He understood now, hiding it from herself, buying time before the weight of it had to be fully acknowledged. He said they were going to take everything. Voss said yes. He said, yay. And you found this in the documents from the quarry? Yes. He said, so when I went up that ditch bank last night, you were saving your own family's land, Voss said. You just didn't know it yet. The thing that moved through Ethan Ward in that moment was not simple. It was not the clean, bright feeling that stories sometimes describe as the triumphant revelation, the sudden clarity. It was more complicated than that and more human. It was the feeling of looking back at a decision you made in the dark without information, and discovering that the information, had you had it, would have told you to do exactly what you did. It was the feeling of the instinct and the fact arriving at the same place from different directions. He'd gone up the bank for Rosa. He'd gone because she was in the trunk and the men had a gun, and something in him had moved before his mind caught up. He hadn't gone for the farm, for the North 40, for the letter under the seed catalogs. But the farm had been there anyway. His family had been in the balance anyway. The thing he'd done for a stranger had been, without his knowledge, the thing that saved the people he loved most. He looked at the barn wall. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, okay. Gerald said, son. Ethan looked at his father. Gerald said, you didn't know. No. You went anyway. Yes. Gerald Ward looked at his son across the workbench, covered in federal documents, and said nothing else because nothing else was required, and Ethan understood from his father's face everything that would have taken either of them 10 minutes to say out loud. Voss said, I want to be clear about something. Ethan Ward will be named as a material witness in the federal case. His account of the incident at the road, the kidnapping in progress, the armed individuals, the recovery of the weapon that is the thread that allowed us to establish probable cause and move on the quarry within hours rather than days or weeks. Without that thread, Briggs is still in his house this morning, and Decker is still running his operation. She paused. That's the record. That's what this case is built on. Marco said, it's also what Ethan is going to have to live with. The visibility. Voss looked at Marco. Marco said, a federal case this size doesn't stay local. When this goes to trial, and it will go to trial, Decker isn't going to plead the witness list as public. His name is going to be in the press. In this county, in this state, potentially nationally. Voss said, that's correct. Marco said, which means Decker's remaining people will know exactly who he is and where he farms. The temperature in the barn changed. Ethan said, you're saying I'm a target. Marco said, I'm saying that when men like Decker go to trial, they tend to express their displeasure with witnesses who put them there. Not directly, they're too careful for direct. But through their network, through pressure, through the kind of ambient threat that doesn't require specific action. Voss said, we take witness security seriously. Marco said, I know you do. I'm not impugning your agency's process. I'm telling Ethan the reality. He looked at Ethan. This is the part where I tell you what the Hells Angels offered to someone who did what you did. The barn was very quiet. Marco said, you'll have a contact, one of ours local, someone you can reach anytime. You won't see people on your land unless you ask. We're not going to make your farm into an outpost. But you'll have a number, and when you call it, the response will be fast. He paused. More than that, the Ward farm is known now. Every chapter within 200 miles knows what happened here last night. Nobody with bad intentions toward this family is going to find it easy operating in this county. Ethan said, that's a lot. Marco said, it's what's given. Ethan said, I didn't do what I did to earn something. Marco said, I know that. That's exactly why it's given. He held Ethan's gaze. You pulled my mother out of a car trunk alone in the dark with the fence post and no guarantees. The Hells Angels do not forget that. Ever. Rosa said quietly from her position at the wall. Ever. The words sat in the barn and meant what it meant. Voss looked between them and had the expression of a federal agent watching something that didn't fit neatly into any procedural category, but was also clearly not her jurisdiction in any way that mattered. She said, I'll let you work out the details of that particular arrangement without my input. She gathered her folders. What I need from Ethan in the next 48 hours is a full written statement, a recorded deposition, and availability for follow-up questions as the investigation develops. After that, he'll be contacted by the U.S. Attorney's Office regarding trial testimony when the time comes. Ethan said, you'll have all of it. Voss said, I know I will. She looked at him, the full direct look of a woman who spent her career reading people under pressure. You did right, Mr. Ward. Start to finish. She picked up her laptop and left the barn with her agents, and the space she left behind had the particular feeling of a formal chapter, closing, and an informal one beginning. Gerald said, I need some air. He said it in the way that meant he needed a moment that wasn't in front of other people. He went out the side door. Ethan watched him go. He gave him 30 seconds, then he followed. His father was standing at the side of the barn facing the field, his back to the yard, and the road and all of it. He had his hands in his jacket pockets. He was looking at the corn that wasn't planted yet, the dark soil that was his grandfather's soil, that was his father's soil, that was his soil that had been almost taken. Ethan stood beside him. Gerald said, I should have fought harder. The South 40. When they pushed the assessment, I should have. Ethan said, you did everything you could do against a system that was rigged against you before you started. That's not losing. That's being cheated. Gerald was quiet. Ethan said, there's a difference. Gerald said, I know the difference. A pause. Wait, I just didn't know which one it was at the time. They stood together in the early morning beside the barn wall, and Ethan thought about how long his father had been carrying the weight of a fight. He thought he'd lost because he wasn't strong enough, or smart enough, or resourceful enough, when the truth was that the fight had been rigged from the inside out by men with money and power and a purchased sheriff, and not a single concern for the people they were grinding down. He said, we're going to get the South 40 back. Gerald said, you don't know that. No, Ethan said, but I know what's in those documents, and I know what Briggs is saying, and I know that Rosa Mendoza's people are going to fund the legal work. So I'm going to say it anyway. He paused. We're going to get it back, Dad. Gerald Ward stood very still for a moment. Then he said, your grandfather would have liked this morning, not the trouble, but the after. He gestured small and imprecise at the yard, the road, the tables with the tablecloths. He liked people. He liked a crowd. He used to say a farm without visitors was just a piece of ground. Ethan said, I remember. Gerald said, yeah. He took his hands out of his pockets. He straightened. Okay. They went back into the yard together. What happened through the rest of that morning happened in layers, the way things do when a large event moves into its aftermath, and the aftermath has its own architecture. Voss's team ran their processing. Marco coordinated the gradual, organized redistribution of 2,000 people from a county road in Iowa, which looked from the outside like a very long, very loud, very well-organized departure that took the better part of 6 hours and generated 3 separate calls to the county dispatch from residents who didn't understand what they were seeing. Dave Kowalski drove out at 9 a.m. in a truck that had seen better decades and knocked on the ward door, and Patricia let him in and made him coffee, and he sat at the kitchen table with Gerald for 40 minutes talking about the specifics of what Voss had told them and what the legal process looked like and what Kowalski needed to do next. When he left, he shook Gerald's hand and looked like a man who'd put down something he'd been carrying for 3 years. Tom Henderson called at 10:30. He didn't drive out. He called, and Ethan took the call on the porch, and Tom Henderson was 71 years old and had farmed in this county since he was 19, and he said things on that phone call that Ethan would not repeat to anyone because they were between the two of them, and some things belonged to the people involved in them. But when the call ended, Ethan sat on the porch step for a few minutes and didn't move. Rosa found him there. She sat beside him again, the same step, and she didn't ask him how the call went because she could read how the call went from the way he was sitting. She said, Henderson? He said, yeah. She said, he's been alone with it for a long time. He said, he thought he was the only one. He thought he was the only one who lost something that way. He didn't know about the other 18 families. Rosa said Decker kept them isolated. If they'd known about each other, they would have compared notes, Ethan said. They would have seen the pattern. Yes, Rosa said. Isolation is the tool. It always is. She paused. Now they know. Henderson knows. Kowalski knows. By tonight, every family in that document will know because in a county, this size word moves faster than any official notification. She paused. That matters. He said, it doesn't give him his grandfather's tractor back. She said, no, not today, but knowing he didn't fail, knowing the system failed him, that someone targeted him deliberately, that changes something. Even before the legal work starts, that changes something. He looked at his hands. His knuckles were still slightly swollen from the road. The impact of the post driver on Crew's arm had transferred up the shaft, and he jammed 2 fingers on the crash into the car hood without registering it at the time. He hadn't mentioned it to anyone. It wasn't serious. It was just there. He said, "Last night I was fixing fence post." Rosa said, "I know." He said, 5:40 in the morning. Fence post. That was my life. She said, "It still is." That's the part people miss when something like this happens to a person. They think everything changes. The farm is still here. The posts still need fixing. Your father's cough still comes through the wall in the morning. She paused. What changes is one specific thing. Just one. He said, "What thing?" She said, "You know what you're made of. You didn't know before. Most people go their whole lives without knowing. You know now." She paused. "That's not nothing. That's actually everything." He sat with that. Marco appeared at the corner of the house. He said, "Voss is wrapping up her on-site work. She wants Ethan for a final walkthrough, just confirming some details about the road incident for the chain of evidence." Ethan stood. Marco said, "And then there's something else." Ethan looked at him. Marco said, "Come with me." He led Ethan out to the county road. Most of the bikes were gone now. The great departure had been running for hours, orderly and steady, but there were still several dozen men in the immediate area, and as Ethan came through the gate onto the road shoulder, some of them turned. One man came forward. He was older than most late 60s, Ethan guessed, with a white beard and the specific kind of face that had been through weather of every variety and retained a fundamental steadiness underneath all of it. He wore his cut with the ease of something that had been part of his body for decades. He put his hand out. Ethan shook it. The man said, "My name is Cal. I run the regional council." He said it simply without inflection that asked for a response. "I've been in this life for 40 years. I've seen a lot of things that I'd call significant." He looked at Ethan with the steady, unhurried attention of someone who had earned the right to take his time. "What you did last night is in that category." Ethan said, "I did what made sense at the time." Cal said, "That's what it always is. The people who end up doing significant things in moments that matter are the people who do what makes sense to them when it makes sense to nobody else." He paused. "Marco told me about the fence post." Ethan said, "It was what I had." Cal almost smiled. "It's always what you have." He reached into his cut and took something out. He held it for a moment before he offered it, and Ethan understood without being told that the holding was intentional, not dramatic, just considered. Then he opened his hand. It was a coin, old heavy, the kind of challenge coin that Ethan had heard about but never held. One side had the Hells Angels death head. The other side had something engraved, 3 words. He had to tilt it toward the light to read them. "He did right." Ethan looked up. Cal said, "You carry that. You ever find yourself in a situation anywhere in this country where you need help, you show that to the right person and you'll have it." He paused. "That's not a small thing. I want to be clear about the weight of what I'm putting in your hand." Ethan said, "I understand." Cal said, "I don't think you do yet, but you will." He closed Ethan's fingers around the coin. "What you started last night isn't finished with the arrest. The county is going to go through changes. The families are going to need advocates, people who are known." He looked at Ethan. "You're known now, in ways that will open doors." Ethan said, "I'm a farmer." Cal said, "Lincoln was a rail splitter. Grant was a tanner. The thing you do for work isn't the thing you are." He stepped back. "Keep farming. Keep fixing your fence posts. Be exactly who you are. That's all it takes." He turned and went back to his bike, and Ethan stood on the road shoulder in the morning sun with a coin in his closed fist that weighed about what a silver dollar weighs and felt heavier than anything he'd carried in his life. Marco came up beside him. Ethan said, "He doesn't say things like that to people very often." Marco said, "No, he doesn't." Ethan looked at the coin. He said, "He did right." Marco said, "Those were my words when Voss asked me to summarize the witness account in one line for the federal record." He paused. "I thought they were accurate." Ethan said, "They're the same words the voice used, on the phone from the kitchen, when Rosa called you." Marco looked at him. Ethan said, "She handed me the phone and the voice on the other end said, 'Tell him he did right.'" Marco said, "That was me, on the phone, at 4:40 in the morning when I didn't know anything yet, except that my mother was safe and there was a young man named Ethan Ward who'd made that happen." Ethan was quiet. Marco said, I meant it then. I mean it now, he paused. I'll mean it for the rest of my life, Ethan. The morning ran itself out the way mornings do, 1 hour at a time, each one slightly different from the one before. Voss finished her on-site work and left with her team at 11:15. By noon, the county road was clear enough that a normal vehicle could pass without navigating around parked motorcycles, which it hadn't been able to do since before sunrise. The food the church women had brought was gone. Patricia Ward's tablecloths were folded and returned to whatever drawer they lived in. The farm was quiet in the way a farm is quiet after something large has moved through it. Not the quiet of nothing having happened, but the specific quiet of the aftermath, which has its own texture. Rosa came to say goodbye at 12:30. She stood in the yard with Ethan and Patricia and Gerald, and she looked at the three of them the way you look at people who have become part of a story you'll carry forward. She said to Patricia, "The tablecloths." Patricia said, "What about them?" And Rosa said, "You put tablecloths on the tables." She paused. "For 400 bikers at 6 in the morning." Patricia said, "People eat better off a set table. That's not my opinion, that's just true." Rosa looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Your son got that from you." Patricia said, "What?" Rosa said, "The part of him that went up the ditch bank. The part that does what makes sense when nothing about the situation is sensible. He got that from you." She looked at Patricia steadily. "I've watched you this morning. You fed people you'd never met. You sat in the dark and didn't flinch, and you put tablecloths on tables at 6 a.m. because it was the right thing to do." She paused. "That's the same instinct. It comes from somewhere." Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He's a good boy." Rosa said, "He's a good man." Patricia put her hand over her mouth briefly, the gesture of a woman keeping something in that wanted to come out. Then she straightened and said, "You'll drive safe." Rosa said, "I always do." She shook Gerald's hand. She looked at Ethan. She said, "You have the number Marco gave you." He said, "Yes." She said, "Use it if you need it. Don't wait until something is urgent. If something feels wrong, call." He said, "I will." She said, "The Kowalski family and the Hendersons and the other families, they're going to need someone to help them understand the process as it moves forward. Someone they trust. Someone local." He said, "I know." She said, "You'll do that?" He said, "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. The full weighing look, the one he'd first seen across a kitchen table at 5 in the morning, when she was deciding whether to trust a stranger with the most dangerous hour of her life. The look that had somewhere in the hours since stopped weighing and become something else. She said, "My husband would have liked you." Ethan said, "I think I would have liked him." "I." Rosa Mendoza put her hand on his arm. One final time, the same brief, complete gesture she'd used before. Nothing excessive, nothing less than what it was, and then she walked to the waiting vehicle and got in, and Marco drove them out the gate and down the county road, and Ethan watched the vehicle until it was past the curve and gone. Gerald said, "Hell of a night." Ethan said, "Hell of a night." Patricia said, "Come inside, I'll make lunch." They went inside. The kitchen was the same kitchen it had always been. The table was the same table. The Rooster salt shaker was there. The stack of letters that had been under the seed catalogs was still on the corner where Patricia had left it when she stopped pretending it wasn't there, and it would stay there until the process moved, and the first legal notification arrived, and the weight of what those letters contained began slowly in the long way that justice actually moves in the real world to lift. Ethan sat down at the table. He put the coin on the wood in front of him and looked at it. 3 words on one side. The engraving was simple, the font plain, the message without ornamentation. He did right. He'd gone up a ditch bank at 5:40 in the morning with a fence post driver and no plan and no guarantees because a woman was in a trunk and men had a gun, and something in him had moved before his mind caught up, and everything that had come from that, the 2,000 people on the county road, the federal agents in the Quarry Briggs talking in a federal holding room, Decker in cuffs at the Nebraska state line, 19 families about to learn that what they'd lost was stolen and could be recovered. His own family's land intact, and the next fraudulent assessment stopped before it arrived. All of that had come from one decision in the dark made by a 23-year-old farm kid who'd never been anywhere and done nothing remarkable and had fraying laces on his work boots. He hadn't done it to be remarkable. He hadn't done it for the coin or the protection or the 2,000 bikes on his county road or the federal record that said his name was the thread the case was built on. He'd done it because it was what made sense when nothing else did. Because a woman was in a trunk and he had a fence post driver, and 40 acres of dark corn rows behind him, and that had been enough. That, it turned out, was always enough. Patricia put a plate in front of him. Gerald sat across the table. Outside the farm held its ground in the midday sun, 40 acres of Iowa soil that had been here before any of them, and would be here after that, had fed and sustained 3 generations of the same family, and had been inches away from being taken by men who thought the law was something you purchased rather than something you served, and was still here now because a young man had heard a sound he didn't understand and gone toward it instead of away. Ethan picked up his fork. The Wards ate lunch in their kitchen at their table on their land, and the coins sat on the wood between the salt shaker and the edge of the plate, and the afternoon was quiet and ordinary and completely new. And the farm, 40 acres that would one day be 80 again, held them all exactly the way it always had. Some things once defended stay defended. Some debts honestly owed stay paid. And some young men, when the dark comes and the moment asks the question, simply answer it, not for glory, not for reward, but because the answer is already in them, waiting for the dark to come and ask. Ethan Ward had been that young man. He would carry that for the rest of his life. And the rest of his life on this land among these people under this sky was going to be something worth carrying.